Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Psycho series with Psycho 4: The Beginning. Now, Psycho 4: The Beginning was a made-for-TV movie which aired on Showtime in 1990, and this is the fourth film in the Psycho series, but it also acts as a prequel to the original Psycho. Now, Psycho 4 is actually written by Stefano, who actually wrote the screenplay for the original Psycho, which of course was based on Robert Bloch's novel of the same name, and I believe he was also the producer for the show The Outer Limits. The film is also directed by Mick, who is probably mostly known for doing a lot of Stephen King adaptations. Like, he would go on to do the 1994 Stand miniseries, and he also did the remake of The Shining, and he did Desperation, and he also directed the movie Sleepwalkers, which of course was written by Stephen King. But aside from the Stephen King movies that he directed, he also directed Critters 2. Now, Mick is a very hit-or-miss director, in my opinion. Like, he's done some stuff that I liked, but even the stuff that I liked from him, I also feel like has its problems. Like, my favorite thing from him is probably the Stand miniseries, but even that is a very flawed movie. Now, Psycho 4 is essentially a prequel and a sequel in one. The plot of the movie is you're supposed to assume that it's taken place a few years after the events of Psycho 3. Now, at the end of Psycho 3, Norman Bates ended up getting arrested, and you assume that they sent him to a psychiatric hospital. In this movie, you realize that Norman has been released from the psychiatric hospital, and in the movie, there's this radio talk show, and the topic on the show is matricide, which is when a son murders his mother. And what happens is Norman Bates, he calls up this show and he tells the people on this radio show his life story and what drove him crazy and made him become what he was in all the other Psycho films leading up to this. So you get a lot of flashbacks in the movie, and you find out that Norman had a very abusive relationship with his mother, who in the movie, it's kind of implied that his mother may have been schizophrenic or something, and, but what happens is Norman is also telling these people that he's going to kill again. So now the host of this radio show is trying to convince Norman not to do this, that this may be his last chance for redemption, but he then tells her that there is a reason he's doing this, and I don't want to give away what the reason he's gonna kill again actually is. Now, Psycho 4 I thought was a pretty decent sequel. However, I will say I probably had a few problems with it. I definitely liked it a lot better than Psycho 3, but one of my problems with this movie, and this was a problem I also had with Psycho 3, is I feel like this film is trying too hard to be like the original Psycho. Like, during one of the flashback sequences, when you see the young Norman Bates kill this girl, and this was shortly after he already killed his mother and developed the split personality, he screams, "Oh God, Mother! Blood! Blood!" which is a line taken right from the original film, and I was just like, really? I mean, I understand that they're trying to pay tribute to the original film, but I don't know, the way they do it just comes off as being kind of cheesy, to be honest. And one of the things I liked so much about Psycho 2 was I felt like Psycho 2 did a really good job at making it a very different film than the first one. But one of my problems with this movie, as well as Psycho 3, is I feel like it's trying too hard to be like the original film. But one thing I do appreciate about this movie is I like how this movie is not your typical slasher film. and that's one of the problems I had with Psycho 3, was I felt like Psycho 3 was more like your typical horror sequel, more like your generic kind of slasher film. I liked how this film tries to go in a more intelligent direction than Psycho 3 did. And I really liked some of the dialogue between Norman Bates and this radio host, and I really liked how in the movie you see her really trying to convince Norman not to do this, you know, and you see Norman telling her why he feels like he has to do what he's about to do, you know, so it definitely adds a lot of drama to the story. Now, one thing about this movie that I actually thought was kind of hilarious is John Landis, who is the director of movies like Animal House, The Blues Brothers, and An American Werewolf in London. He actually plays one of the characters in this movie. He plays one of the people who works at the radio station. I just thought it was kind of hilarious that John Landis is actually in this movie. Now, in the film, there are a few continuity issues because I know the writer of this movie said that he wanted to ignore the events of Psycho 2 and 3 and just make this like a direct sequel to the original Psycho, but at the same time they do kind of mention the events from Psycho 3, and also like you know, in the movie in Psycho 2 you find out that Norman was actually adopted and his real mother was this woman named Emma Spool. This movie kind of ignores that and says that it was just the person who you always thought was his mother, you know, so there's a few, but the thing is though, like, I could get it if it's like a direct sequel to the original one and ignoring the continuity of parts 2 and 3, but at the same time, they do kind of mention the events from part 3, so, you know, the continuity is a little screwed up in this movie. Overall, though this is not a flawless movie, I thought this was a really good way to end this series, and Psycho is already a movie that arguably did not need sequels to begin with, but honestly, even though I'm not a big fan of Psycho 3, and even though this film has its problems, I would say the sequels to Psycho really aren't too bad, and once again, I think this film is a pretty decent way to end a series, in my opinion. Now, Psycho 4 The Beginning was the final film in the Psycho series. Now, outside of the Psycho series, I know there have been, like, other made-for-TV movies that are kind of, like, loosely based on Psycho or, like, related somehow to the Psycho franchise, and I know Robert Bloch, who wrote the original novel Psycho, which the first movie was based on, wrote 2 sequels to the novel, one called Psycho 2 and the other called Psycho House, but neither one of the 2 sequel novels had anything to do with the film sequels. And of course, recently you had the show Bates Motel, which is kind of like a prequel/reboot to the Psycho franchise. Like, it's about Norman Bates when he was younger, only it's set in a different continuity than the series, and of course, in 1998, you had the Gus Van Sant remake of Psycho. And some of you might be wondering if I'm going to be reviewing that movie. I'm not. I'm not going to be reviewing that movie, but I will briefly touch on that movie. The Gus Van Sant remake of Psycho is one of the biggest pieces of shit I've ever seen in my life. And Gus Van Sant is actually a pretty good director, but that was not one of his better movies at all. Like, if you haven't seen the Psycho remake, don't. Honestly, don't. There's really no point in seeing it, because it is literally a shot-by-shot remake of the original film. But when I say shot-by-shot, I mean literally every scene in that movie is just a reenactment of every scene from the original Psycho. It pretty much is a carbon copy of the original Psycho, only in color and with different actors playing the characters. That's it. There's really no point in seeing the Psycho remake. But that's it. That's my review on Psycho 4 The Beginning, the final film in the Psycho series, and bye.